It was a quiet afternoon in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, the kind where people usually waved to each other and kids rode their bikes until sunset. The day was warm, the sky clear, and the sound of birds mixed with the hum of distant traffic. A 16-year-old boy walked along the sidewalk, his backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder, still wearing his basketball jersey from practice. Sweat still glistened on his forehead, and his sneakers left faint marks on the pavement. His mind was somewhere else, thinking about the game, about homework, about how good a cold drink would taste once he got home. He didn't notice the police car at first. It was parked across the street, engine idling. He walked past it, head down, earbuds in, listening to his music. But after a few moments, he realized the car was slowly following him. The feeling was strange, like eyes on his back. He pulled one earbud out, glancing sideways. The car crept forward again, the sun reflecting off its windshield. His heartbeat picked up, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he didn't know what was happening. A minute later, the flashing red and blue lights came on. The boy stopped. The world around him seemed to go quiet for a second, except for the chirping of the lights. He turned slowly, confused, his hands already half raised out of habit. Two officers stepped out of the car. One of them looked serious, the other slightly tense. They walked toward him with quick steps. "Hey you, stop right there," one of them called out sharply. The tone made the boy's stomach drop. He stopped completely, his heart pounding now. "Can we help you, officers?" he asked quietly, trying to keep his voice calm. "Where are you coming from?" one officer asked, narrowing his eyes. "Show us some ID." The boy blinked, taken aback. "I'm just coming from basketball practice," he said. He pointed to his school name on the jersey, his voice slightly shaky. "I go to the school down the road. I live 2 blocks from here." But the officers didn't seem convinced. One of them stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt. "We got a report of someone matching your description involved in a theft nearby," he said. The words hit hard. The boy frowned in confusion. "A theft?" "Sir, I just left practice an hour ago. I didn't take anything from anyone." The other officer spoke up. "Then you won't mind answering a few questions. Keep your hands where we can see them." The boy raised both hands slightly higher. His fingers trembled. He could feel the eyes of a few neighbors peeking out from porches and windows. The sound of the officers' radios crackled in the background. He thought about calling his mom. She always told him, "If you're ever in trouble, call me first." But when he reached for his phone, one of the officers immediately barked, "Don't move." The sharpness in the voice made him freeze. "It's just my phone," he said softly, his throat tight. "I was going to call my mom." "Keep your hands visible," the officer repeated. The boy slowly raised his hands again. A car passed by, slowing down, then driving off. One of the officers radioed in, asking for confirmation about the description they had received. The boy stood there, trying not to shake, his eyes darting between them. "What's your name?" one officer asked. He answered quietly, still afraid of making a wrong move. He wished his mom was there. She always knew how to handle situations like this. She worked in law enforcement, though most people didn't know exactly what she did. She taught him to stay calm, to speak clearly, and to never argue. But standing there under flashing lights, those lessons felt hard to follow. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. The boy kept repeating that he was coming from practice. He even showed them his basketball still tucked in his bag. They exchanged looks, not fully convinced. The neighborhood was quiet except for the faint buzz of the lights and the occasional sound of a car door shutting in the distance. Then his phone, still in his pocket, began to ring. It was his mother. He didn't move, afraid they might think he was reaching again. One officer noticed the sound and frowned. "You gonna answer that?" the officer asked. "I'd rather not move, sir," the boy replied softly. The officer sighed, then nodded slightly. "Go ahead, but slowly." He pulled the phone out carefully and answered. His mother's voice came through, calm but firm. "Where are you?" "You didn't text me when you left practice." He hesitated. "Mom, I'm okay. The police stopped me. They said I look like someone they're looking for." His voice trembled slightly. There was silence for a second on the other end. Then her tone changed instantly, no longer calm but sharp, controlled, and urgent. "Where exactly are you?" she asked. He gave the street name. "Stay right there," she said. "Don't argue, don't move. I'm coming now." He hung up, trying to swallow the lump in his throat. One of the officers watched him. "Who was that?" the officer asked. My mom, he replied. She's on her way. Good, the officer said, though his tone didn't sound kind. The boy looked down at the ground, his shadow stretching across the pavement. He felt a mix of fear and embarrassment. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet people were staring. He saw an older man with a dog watching from across the street. The man shook his head slightly as if disapproving of what was happening, but didn't say a word. A few kids on bikes stopped at the corner, whispering. One of them took out a phone and started recording. The boy's chest tightened. He didn't want to be on anyone's camera. He didn't want to become a story people whispered about later. One of the officers began to question him again, asking where he lived, who he was with earlier, and whether he had seen anyone suspicious. The boy answered politely, every sentence short and careful. He tried to remember what his mom always said. Stay calm. Don't make it worse, but it was hard. Every time he moved even slightly, the officer's hand twitched toward his holster. The seconds dragged by. The boy could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He looked down at his shoes, scuffed and dirty from practice, and wished he could just vanish. The feeling of being misunderstood hurt more than anything. He wanted to scream, to say, I'm just a kid. But he stayed silent. Down the street, a distant car horn blared. The boy lifted his eyes, hoping it was his mom. He imagined her face, the mix of calm authority she wore at work and the warmth she had at home. She always seemed unshakable, the kind of person who could stand up to anyone. But he had never needed her like this before. The officers continued talking to each other in low voices. One of them seemed unsure now, glancing back toward the patrol car. The description they had received from dispatch didn't seem to match perfectly. Still, they didn't back off completely. The boy shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The sun was beginning to lower, casting long shadows on the street. He could smell the faint scent of cut grass nearby, mixed with the metallic hint of the patrol car's engine. Every detail of the moment seemed to etch itself into his memory. The flashing lights, the uneven pavement, the tension in the air. He tried to take a deep breath, but his chest felt tight. Sir, he said softly, can I please call my mom again? She said she's coming. One officer looked at him, then at his partner. Finally, he nodded. Fine, but stay where you are. He dialed her number again. The call didn't even ring twice before she answered. I'm 2 minutes away, she said firmly. Just breathe. Don't say anything else. I'll be there. Her voice made him feel a little safer, but also more emotional. He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Okay, he whispered. Then he ended the call, putting the phone carefully back in his pocket. The next 2 minutes felt like an eternity. The officers were still watching him closely, their faces unreadable. The air felt heavier, thicker. Even the birds seemed to have gone quiet. A gentle wind passed through the trees, rustling the leaves. The boy stared at the street corner, waiting for the familiar silver car he knew so well. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but somewhere deep down he knew that once his mom arrived, everything was going to change. He could almost hear her voice in his head, strong and sure. Nobody messes with my child. The sound of tires screeching broke through the silence. The silver car turned the corner fast, coming to a stop just a few feet away. The officers looked up sharply. The boy exhaled, relief and fear mixing together. He knew that voice. He knew that look. His mom had arrived, and nothing about this moment would ever be the same again. The car door swung open before it even came to a full stop. The boy's mother stepped out quickly, her eyes scanning the scene. Her face was calm, but her body language carried a sharpness that made everyone freeze. She wore a simple work shirt and dark pants, nothing that revealed who she was. But the way she walked toward them made it clear she wasn't just another bystander. The officers straightened up when they saw her. One of them opened his mouth to speak, but she raised her hand slightly. That's my son, she said firmly. Her voice was steady, controlled, but there was fire beneath the surface. What exactly is going on here? The boy let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had never seen his mom move like that, calm but full of quiet power. The officers exchanged a quick glance. Ma'am, we were just questioning him, one said. We received a report of a suspect fitting his description. She tilted her head slightly. Fitting his description? She repeated slowly. And what description would that be? Her tone was polite, but every word cut like a blade. The officer hesitated. Young male, dark clothing, backpack. Her eyes didn't blink. That describes half the teenagers in this neighborhood. Did you have any other details? Did dispatch mention a school jersey? Basketball gear? Anything at all that would tell you he wasn't your suspect? The other officer shifted uncomfortably. The mother took a slow step forward, standing beside her son now. She rested a hand on his shoulder. Did he do something wrong? She asked quietly. No, ma'am, one replied quickly. We just wanted to ask some questions. Then why, she said, her voice still calm. Were your weapons drawn? The street had grown quiet. Even the kids on bikes had stopped whispering. The older man with the dog stood a little closer now, watching. The officer cleared his throat, looking suddenly uneasy. We didn't draw our weapons, ma'am. We were just being cautious. She raised an eyebrow. Cautious, she echoed. You think my son walking home from practice is a threat? Do you see what he's holding? A basketball. That's it. The boy stayed quiet, watching her. He could feel her hand still on his shoulder, steady and warm. It was the only thing keeping him from breaking down. One officer spoke up again, trying to sound more confident. We were only following procedure, ma'am. She nodded slowly. Then let's talk about procedure, she said, reaching into her jacket pocket. She pulled out her badge, the gold glint catching the sunlight. The officer's eyes widened slightly as they realized what they were looking at. The woman's voice grew colder. Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. The officers froze. One of them, the younger one, swallowed hard. Ma'am, we didn't know. No, she interrupted gently. You didn't, that's the problem. You saw a young black boy, and that was enough for you to stop him. You didn't ask yourself if he looked afraid, if he might be innocent, or if he deserved respect. Her words hung in the air. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The boy looked at his mom, his eyes wide. He had seen her serious before, but never like this. Not this fierce, steady mix of calm and fury. Finally, one of the officers murmured, We're sorry, ma'am. She didn't look at him. She looked at her son. You okay? She asked softly. He nodded, though his throat felt tight. She turned back to the officers. You owe him an apology, not me. Both officers nodded awkwardly. One stepped forward, clearing his throat. Kid, I'm sorry. We didn't mean to scare you. The boy said nothing at first. He just looked at them, then at his mom, who gave a small nod. Finally, he whispered, Okay. The apology didn't fix anything, but it was something. The officers backed off slowly, retreating toward their car. The flashing lights turned off. The boy exhaled deeply, feeling like he could finally breathe again. His mom put an arm around him and led him toward her car. When they got inside, she sat for a moment before starting the engine. She was still breathing hard, though her face stayed calm. You did good, she said softly. You stayed calm. That's the most important thing. He nodded, staring out the window. The quiet stretched between them, heavy and full of unspoken things. Mom, he finally said, his voice small. Why did they stop me? I didn't do anything. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. I know, she said quietly. Sometimes people make decisions based on fear, not facts. It's not fair and it's not right. But that's why we have to be twice as smart, twice as calm. He didn't answer. He looked down at his hands, still trembling slightly. She glanced at him, her expression softening. Hey, she said gently. Look at me. He did. You didn't do anything wrong. Don't ever think you did. He nodded again, though his eyes were wet. She started the car and pulled away from the curb. The neighborhood slipped past, familiar houses and quiet lawns. But for both of them, the world suddenly felt different. They drove in silence for a while. Finally, she said, You know, I've worked with police officers my whole career. Most of them are good people who want to help. But sometimes they forget what they're supposed to protect, the people. She paused, her voice softening. That's why I do what I do. Because we need more people who understand that everyone deserves respect. He listened quietly, absorbing every word. The streetlights flickered on as the sun dipped lower. The warmth of the afternoon had faded into a cool evening breeze. He thought about how fast everything had changed. 1 minute he was walking home. The next he was terrified, standing under flashing lights. When they got home, she unlocked the front door and placed her badge on the kitchen counter. He sat at the table, still processing what had happened. She poured him a glass of water and set it in front of him. Drink, she said softly. He did, though his hand still shook. After a moment, she sat across from him. You did everything right, she said again. But I want you to remember something. If you're ever in that situation again, and I pray you won't be, you stay calm, you speak clearly, and you call me right away. Understand? He nodded. I did call you. A faint smile crossed her face. Yes, you did. And that saved you. Never forget that your life is worth protecting no matter what anyone makes you feel. He looked at her and for the first time, truly understood the weight of what she carried every day. Being in law enforcement wasn't just a job for her. It was a shield, a mission, and sometimes a battle. Later that night, he couldn't sleep. The blue and red light still flashed in his mind. Every sound outside made him jump. He walked into the living room where his mom sat reading files at the coffee table. She looked up immediately. Can't sleep? She asked. He shook his head. She closed the folder and patted the couch beside her. Come here, she said. He sat next to her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said quietly, You know, when I joined the Bureau, I thought I could change things from the inside. Some days I still believe that. Other days I wonder if the system changes us more than we change it. He looked at her, confused. She smiled faintly. What I mean is, sometimes people forget why they started doing something. They stop seeing the people in front of them. But you can't let that happen to you. No matter what you face, don't lose your kindness. That's your strength. He leaned his head on her shoulder. She wrapped an arm around him. Mom, he whispered, what if they had... He couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't let him. They didn't. You're here. That's all that matters. Her voice trembled slightly for the first time that night. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Then she added softly, But tomorrow I'm filing a report. Not just because of what happened to you, but because no mother should ever have to see her child like that. He didn't say anything. He just nodded against her shoulder. The house was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. The moment stretched out, heavy but full of love. That night, the boy finally drifted off to sleep on the couch beside his mom. She sat awake a while longer, staring at her badge on the table. It gleamed softly under the lamplight. For years it had been a symbol of pride, of justice, of fairness. But now it also carried a reminder of what could go wrong, even in the hands of those meant to protect. When she finally stood and turned off the light, she whispered to herself, Tomorrow we make this right. The next morning started quietly. The boy sat at the kitchen table staring at his cereal, not really eating. The house felt heavy, like it was still carrying the tension from the night before. His mother was already dressed for work, her badge clipped to her belt, her face calm but focused. She moved around the kitchen with purpose, pouring coffee and checking her phone for messages, but every now and then, her eyes drifted toward him, softening for just a second before turning serious again. He hadn't said much since the incident. His sleep had been restless, full of half-dreams that blended fear with confusion. Every time he closed his eyes, the flashing red and blue lights came back. He could still hear the sharp tone in the officers' voices, the feeling of being watched like a criminal. It sat deep in his chest, a mix of anger and disbelief he didn't know how to express. His mother sat across from him and sipped her coffee slowly. You don't have to go to school today, she said softly. I already called the office. You can take the day off. He nodded, grateful but quiet. Are you going to work? He asked. She set her cup down. I have to. I need to speak to some people about what happened, but I'll be back early. There was a long pause before he finally said, Are you mad? She looked at him, her eyes calm. Mad? She repeated. Yes, but not at you. She took a deep breath. I'm angry that you had to go through that. I'm angry that the people I work with, people who are supposed to protect others, made you feel unsafe. That's not how it's supposed to be. He looked down at the table. You think they'll get in trouble? Her expression hardened slightly. They'll be questioned, she said. And if I have anything to do with it, they'll be trained again. Properly. She reached across the table and touched his hand. But more importantly, I'm going to make sure something like this doesn't happen to another kid. He nodded slowly. He wanted to believe that things could change. But part of him wondered if people really did change, or if they just said the right things when someone important was watching. After she left, the house felt empty. He wandered into the living room and sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone. To his surprise, he saw a short video clip posted by someone from the neighborhood. It showed him from the day before standing on the street with the officers, hands in the air. The caption read, Cop stopped teen for no reason. There were hundreds of comments. Some people were angry, others were arguing, and a few were defending the officers. His heart raced as he scrolled through them. Some people called him brave. Others called him suspicious. He locked his phone and set it face down. He didn't know how to feel. He hadn't asked to be in a video. He hadn't wanted attention. He just wanted to walk home. When his mom came home that afternoon, she found him sitting on the porch staring off down the street. "You okay?" she asked gently. He nodded but didn't say much. She sat beside him, resting her elbows on her knees. "You saw the video, didn't you?" she asked. He nodded again. "Yeah, everyone's talking about it," she sighed softly. "I figured that might happen. Things spread fast these days. Do you think it's bad?" he asked quietly. She thought for a moment. "No, it's the truth. Sometimes people need to see what really happens before they believe it. Maybe this will make someone think twice before they judge another person by how they look." He didn't answer. He just leaned back, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. After a few minutes, he asked, "Did you talk to your boss?" She nodded. "I did. He's taking it seriously. There's going to be a review of how local officers are handling stops like that. It's not going to fix everything overnight, but it's a start." He looked at her with a small, uncertain smile. "You really think it'll help?" "I have to believe it will," she said quietly. "Because if I stop believing that, then nothing will ever change." Later that evening, the doorbell rang. It was one of the neighbors, an older woman who lived 2 houses down. She brought over a small plate of cookies and said she'd seen the whole thing. "Your son did nothing wrong," she told his mother firmly. He was polite, calm. Those officers overstepped. She shook her head sadly. The world shouldn't make kids afraid like that. His mother thanked her and promised to stay in touch. After the neighbor left, she handed him one of the cookies. He smiled a little. "She's nice." "She is," his mom agreed. "And it's good to know people care." The next few days were strange. People from the neighborhood kept stopping them to talk, some to offer support, some to ask what really happened. The local news station even called, asking for an interview, but his mother declined. "We're not turning this into a spectacle," she said. "This isn't about fame. It's about change." At school, things were awkward. His friends had seen the video too. Some of them asked questions, others didn't know what to say. He appreciated the ones who treated him normally. But every now and then he caught someone staring at him in the hallway, whispering to someone else. He couldn't tell if it was sympathy or curiosity. Either way, he didn't like it. That night, he sat in his room, scrolling through messages from classmates. One read, "Can't believe that happened to you. You okay?" Another said, "Man, you're famous now." He didn't reply to either. He put his phone away and looked out the window. The world outside looked the same as before, but it didn't feel the same. He no longer saw the street as just the way home. Now it was a place where something had broken, a piece of innocence he might never get back. His mom knocked softly and came in. "You've been quiet today," she said. "You want to talk about it?" He shrugged. "Everyone keeps looking at me like I'm some kind of story. But I'm not. I just want things to be normal again." She nodded, understanding. "I know. But sometimes when something unfair happens, it shines a light on things people try to ignore. And I think maybe, just maybe, your story can help others." He looked at her. "But I didn't do anything." "You didn't have to," she said softly. Just being you and standing there, staying calm, was enough to show what was wrong with the situation. People saw it. He thought about that. He wasn't sure he wanted to be seen like that. Not as a symbol, not as someone's example. He just wanted to go back to shooting hoops after school and worrying about grades instead of headlines. That weekend, they attended a community meeting. It was organized by local leaders and police representatives to discuss the incident and ways to improve trust. The room was full: parents, teens, officers, and even reporters. The boy sat beside his mother, listening as people spoke. Some shared stories of similar experiences. Others offered suggestions on how to rebuild communication between police and the community. When it was his mother's turn to speak, she stood tall, her voice steady. "What happened to my son should never happen to anyone," she said. "We can talk about training, about policy, but at the heart of it, this is about humanity. My child was treated as a suspect before anyone saw him as a person. That has to change." The room was silent. The boy watched her with pride. She wasn't just his mom in that moment. She was a force, a protector, a truth teller. After the meeting, several people came up to them, thanking her for her courage and for speaking up. One officer, older and humble-looking, approached quietly. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been on the force for 20 years.
I can't speak for everyone, but I promise you, some of us are listening." She nodded respectfully.
"That's all I ask," she replied. On the drive home, the car was quiet at first. Then his mom reached over and squeezed his hand. "You did good sitting through that," she said with a small smile. "Not easy to relive it." He looked out the window at the passing lights. It felt weird hearing people talk about it like it was just another story. She nodded slowly. "I know, but remember, the story isn't over. What happened to you started something, maybe small but important." He looked at her, thoughtful. For the first time since that day, he felt a flicker of something other than fear. Maybe hope, maybe strength. He didn't know yet. But he knew one thing. He didn't want what happened to him to be forgotten. When they got home, he went to his room and sat on the edge of his bed. He pulled out his notebook and started writing. Not for school, not for anyone else, but for himself. He wrote about what it felt like, what he saw, what he learned. He wrote about his mom's courage and the silence that had hung in the air that day. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a release. Down the hall, his mom peeked in and saw him writing. She didn't say anything. She just smiled quietly and turned off the light in the hallway. Outside, the night was calm again. The world hadn't changed overnight. But maybe, just maybe, it was starting to listen. The sound of her tires screeching against the pavement echoed through the street as she pulled up beside the flashing lights. Her heart was pounding so hard that she could hear it in her ears. Every second she had spent driving there felt like a lifetime. When she stepped out of the car, she wasn't just a mother. She was someone trained to protect, to demand answers, and to fight for what's right. But at that moment, she wasn't thinking like an agent. She was thinking like a terrified parent whose child was standing frozen under the glare of police lights. Her son stood there, his hands still raised, eyes wide with confusion and fear. The officers hadn't yet noticed who had arrived. They were too focused on the teenager in front of them, shouting orders he could barely process. When she slammed her door and strode forward, her voice cut through the chaos. "That's my son," she shouted, flashing her badge so quickly it gleamed in the fading light. "Lower your weapons, now." The officers froze. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The authority in her voice didn't sound like a plea. It sounded like a command they were trained to obey. Both officers looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. The older one slowly lowered his hand from his holster, while the younger officer hesitated, still gripping his radio like it could protect him from the storm that was about to hit. Her son blinked, hardly believing what he was seeing. His mother's face was full of fury, but behind that anger was relief that he was still alive. She took a step closer to him, her eyes never leaving the officers. "You're done pointing weapons at my child," she said, her voice steady but shaking at the edges with emotion. "You had no reason, no right to treat him like this." The officer who had been shouting the orders finally found his voice. "Ma'am, we were responding to a call about—" "Don't you dare finish that sentence," she cut in sharply. "You stopped a child walking home from school, a child who did nothing wrong. You looked at him and saw a threat before you saw a person. Tell me, what exactly made him look suspicious to you? His backpack? His skin?" The silence that followed was heavy. The small crowd of onlookers who had been recording the entire encounter grew even quieter. The tension in the air could be felt by everyone. One of the bystanders whispered to another, "She's an agent," and the words spread quickly among them. The officers' faces turned pale as the realization sank in. Her son took a hesitant step toward her, and she reached out a hand, keeping her other one raised toward the officers in a silent warning. "It's okay," she whispered to him, her voice softening. "You're safe now." He nodded, his breathing shaky, still struggling to process everything that had happened in the last few minutes. One of the officers finally lowered his gaze and mumbled, "We didn't mean any harm." Her expression hardened. "You don't get to say that," she said quietly. "Because if I hadn't gotten here in time, this could have ended in a way none of us could undo. You should know better." She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm in her chest. "You wear that badge to protect, not to intimidate. Remember that." She turned to her son again, placing a hand on his shoulder, grounding herself in the moment. "We're leaving," she said firmly, then looked back at the officers. "And you'll be hearing from me." The officers didn't argue. They just stood there, faces full of regret and fear, watching as she guided her son to the car. The murmurs of the crowd followed them, mixed with the sound of her son's quiet sniffles. As she opened the car door for him, she looked back once more at the officers, her eyes saying everything her words didn't. Once they were in the car, she sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her hands were shaking, and she realized she hadn't taken a full breath since she arrived. Her son was silent beside her, staring down at his hands. The weight of what almost happened hung between them. She reached out and held his hand, squeezing gently. "You did nothing wrong," she said softly. "Do you understand me?" "Nothing." He nodded, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. He wasn't sure how to feel, relieved, scared, angry, or all of them at once. She wanted to take that pain away, to erase the fear that had settled into him, but she knew it wasn't that simple. Once something like this happens, it doesn't just fade. It leaves a mark. As they drove away, she noticed people still standing there, watching. Some waved in support, others held up their phones, still recording. She didn't care about the attention or what people might post later. All she cared about was getting her son home safely. The car ride was quiet for a long time. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with orange and pink, but neither of them noticed. Finally he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Mom, were they going to hurt me?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him no, that everything would have been fine, but she couldn't lie to him. "I don't know," she admitted. "And that's what scares me." He looked out the window, blinking back tears. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said again, this time like he was trying to convince himself. "I know," she said gently. "You never have to prove that to me." When they got home, she went straight to her office and began writing everything down. The officers' names, the time, the location, everything she could remember. Her training told her to document first, to stay calm, to be professional. But her hand still trembled as she typed. The mother in her was fighting with the agent inside her. The mother wanted to scream. The agent wanted to make sure justice was done. Her son sat quietly in the living room, holding his phone, seeing the notifications pile up as videos of the incident spread online. Comments flooded in, some supportive, others cruel. He turned the phone face down on the table. He didn't want to see it. He didn't want to relive it. After a while, she joined him on the couch. The anger in her had cooled into something quieter but stronger, a determination. "We're not letting this go," she told him. "Not because of who I am, but because of what's right." He nodded, though he didn't fully understand what that meant yet. He was still trying to feel normal again. She looked at him, her heart breaking at how shaken he still seemed. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "we'll talk more. Tonight, just rest." He leaned against her shoulder, and for a moment they just sat there in silence. The sound of the city outside filled the room, a reminder that life was still moving on even after the chaos. She closed her eyes, thinking about how easily things could have gone differently. How many times had she heard similar stories in her job, stories that didn't end this way? The thought haunted her, but it also fueled her. She knew what she had to do. This wasn't just about her son anymore. It was about making sure no other parent ever had to show up to a scene like that, praying they weren't too late. She looked down at him again, brushing his hair gently from his face. "You're safe," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "You're safe." He didn't answer, but he leaned into her a little closer. And in that small movement, she found a bit of peace. The night was still, the storm had passed, but she knew the real fight was only beginning. The next morning came quietly. The boy woke up to the soft hum of the city outside, but for the first time in a while he didn't feel like getting out of bed. He stared at the ceiling, thinking about the night before, about the lights, the shouting, and the look on his mother's face when she arrived. It was all still fresh, like it had happened just moments ago. He didn't know how to feel anymore. Part of him wanted to forget it, pretend it had never happened, but another part knew he couldn't. Something had changed in him. He finally got up and walked to the kitchen where his mother was already sitting at the table. Her laptop was open, papers spread out beside her, and a cup of coffee sat untouched. She looked tired but focused. The air felt heavy, not because of anger, but because of everything that still needed to be said. "Morning," he said quietly. She looked up and gave him a small smile. "Morning, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" He shrugged. I don't know, weird, she nodded. That's okay. It's a lot to process. He sat down across from her and glanced at the papers. Are you working on what happened? Yes, she said. I've already filed the report. But it's not just about the report now. There's going to be a full review and the department wants me to speak at a meeting next week. He frowned. A meeting? What kind of meeting? It's with the local police board, she explained. They want to talk about the way officers are trained to handle stops like the one you went through. They asked if I'd share what happened from a parent's point of view. He looked down at his hands. Do you have to? She sighed softly. I don't have to, but I want to. If speaking up helps even one kid stay safe, then it's worth it. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he asked, Can I go with you? Her eyes softened. If you want to. You don't have to, though. I want to, he said quietly. I want them to see me, to see who they scared for no reason. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand gently. Then we'll go together. Over the next few days, life began to settle again, though not completely. The story from that night had spread through the community, shared online and talked about in schools, cafes, and churches. Some people reached out to offer support, while others stayed silent, unsure of what to say. The boy tried to keep things normal, but even the simple act of walking to school now made him anxious. Every police car that passed made his stomach twist. His friends tried to make him laugh again, and slowly, he started to feel like himself. But something deeper had changed. He had started to see the world differently. He noticed how some people crossed the street when he walked by, or how others stared for just a second too long. Before, he might not have thought much about it. Now he couldn't help but see it. His mother watched him carefully during those days, trying not to hover but always nearby. She had her own battles to fight, meetings to attend, and reports to finalize, but she made sure to sit with him every evening, even if they didn't talk much. Sometimes they just watched TV in silence, their presence enough to remind each other they weren't alone. The day of the meeting came. The building was crowded, filled with officials, reporters, and community members. Cameras were set up in the back, but his mother didn't seem nervous. She looked calm and composed, dressed neatly in her dark suit, her badge clipped to her belt. He sat beside her, his hands folded in his lap, his heart beating fast. When it was her turn to speak, she stood and faced the room. What happened to my son, she began, was not just a misunderstanding. It was a symptom of something deeper, a problem that can't be fixed with a simple apology. Her voice was firm but calm, the kind of tone that made people stop and listen. He was treated as a threat, not as a child. And the fact that I wear the same badge as the officers who did this doesn't make it any less wrong. The room was quiet. Every word she spoke carried weight. We can talk about policy and training, but at the heart of it, this is about humanity. We need to teach empathy, not just procedure. Because one day, the person standing in front of you could be someone's child, someone's world. The boy watched her with pride. He had always known his mother was strong, but seeing her like this, fighting not just for him but for everyone, made him see her in a new light. She wasn't just his mother anymore. She was a voice for all the people who couldn't speak. When she finished, the room erupted in quiet applause. Some people nodded in agreement, others wiped their eyes. One of the senior officials stood up and said, "Thank you for your honesty. We hear you. And we promise change is coming." Afterward, several reporters tried to approach, but she declined every interview. "This isn't about publicity," she told them. "It's about accountability." As they left the building, her son looked up at her. "You were amazing," he said softly. She smiled. "So were you. Just being here took courage." They walked outside into the sunlight, and for the first time in weeks it felt warm again, not just from the weather, but from the sense of hope that something good might come from what they had gone through. In the days that followed, things began to shift. The local police department announced a new community program, one focused on youth engagement and communication. Officers were required to attend new training sessions that included real stories like theirs. The chief even reached out privately to thank her for speaking up, admitting that sometimes the system needed to be reminded of its purpose. At home, the boy started writing again. What had begun as a way to process his fear turned into something more, a story about courage, about standing up, about change. His mother read it one evening, sitting quietly in his room as he watched her face. When she finished, she smiled. "You have a gift," she said softly. "You should share it." He hesitated. "What if people don't listen?" She shook her head. "They will, because it's real, and real stories have power." A few weeks later, he agreed to speak briefly at his school's assembly. The principal had heard about what happened and wanted students to hear his story, not to scare them, but to help them understand. Standing on the stage looking out at hundreds of faces, he felt his knees tremble. But then he remembered his mother's words. He took a deep breath and said, "I used to think the world was always fair. But I learned that sometimes people see you differently for reasons you can't control. That's not okay, but we can change it. By listening, by speaking up, by caring." The room was silent when he finished. Then slowly the students began to clap. Not the loud kind of applause that comes with excitement, but the soft, steady kind that comes from respect. That night, as they drove home, his mother looked at him and smiled. "You did something brave today," she said. "I'm proud of you." He looked out the window, watching the city lights blur by. I'm proud of me too." From then on, things didn't magically become perfect. There were still moments when he felt uneasy around police cars, still flashes of memory that made his heart race. But he wasn't afraid anymore, not the way he used to be. He had faced something that could have broken him, and instead it had made him stronger. His mother continued her work with quiet determination. People in the community began to recognize her, not as just an agent, but as a mother who stood up. She didn't seek credit or fame. She only wanted progress, and slowly she started to see it. One evening, months later, as they walked home together from a community event, the boy noticed something different. The same street where everything had once gone wrong now felt lighter, almost peaceful. The neighbors smiled as they passed. A group of kids played basketball nearby, their laughter echoing through the block. He stopped for a moment, looking at the spot where it all happened. The fear that once lived there inside him felt smaller now, almost distant. He turned to his mother and said quietly, "I'm okay now." She smiled, her eyes shining in the dim streetlight. "I know," she said, "and I'm so proud of you." They walked the rest of the way home side by side, their shadows stretching long behind them. The world wasn't perfect, but it was changing, and they were part of that change. And though the memory of that night would always stay with them, it had become something else now. Not just a story of fear and anger, but one of strength, love, and hope.